We have Cape Breton oat cakes, and they're in the shape of Cape Breton. And we also have chocolate chip cookies and a few other treats over there. My name is Father Douglas McDonald, and I'm the chaplain here at CBU. And I'm happy to be able to welcome all of you here to CBU Chaplaincy. We have a special guest with us, Dr. Peter Ludlow, and he is the diocesan historian. And he's been researching much of the archives from St. FX to here in the Beaton Institute, and meeting with many people over the last number of years. He has compiled a history that takes off from where Dr. A.A. Johnson left off. Many of you are aware of the 2-volume history of Dr. Johnson, and we're blessed to have Dr. Peter Ludlow, who has picked up the baton from him and is providing the next phase of our glorious and often always troubled history. So it's such it is with life and with church as well. And so I'd like to invite up one of our students who is on the CBU Chaplaincy Ministry team from the Bahamas. Her name is Jade Russell, and she works here with me and with the students, and she'll read the biography and officially introduce our guest.
Dr. Peter Ludlow is originally from Antigonish. He is an official historian for the Diocese of Antigonish, a historian of religion and culture in Canada. He holds a PhD from Queen's University, Belfast. He is the former president of the Canadian Catholic Historical Association and currently serves as editor of Canada's only scholarly journal dedicated to the history of Catholicism. Widely published, his first book, The Canny Scot, Archbishop James Morrison of Antigonish, was released by McGill's Queen's University Press in 2015. His latest book, Disciples of Antigonish, Catholics in Nova Scotia, 1880 to 1960, also published by McGill's Queen's, is a social history of one of Canada's most important Catholic regions. I'd like to welcome Dr. Peter Ludlow.
Thank you very much. Oh, there's the speaker. All right, I had some slides. I'm not going to have them, so I'll try to, we can all use our imagination a little bit. Great to be here. Thanks, Father Doug, for inviting me to Cape Breton University and to be talking about my latest book, Disciples of Antigonish, which is an examination, as we heard, of Catholics in eastern Nova Scotia from 1880 to 1960. So I'm going to focus this afternoon on the area broadly known as industrial Cape Breton. And I'm going to look sort of widely at some key moments and themes that are in my book that I think are important and that I think you'll find useful. Now, I grew up in St. Andrews, which is a rural parish in Antigonish County, but my father was a native of New Aberdeen in Glace Bay. Is that a little better? Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's great. So my father's from New Aberdeen and Glace Bay. So my perspective of the faith community and the historic role of the Catholic Church within society was shaped by drastically different narratives. So it's common for people, I think, to view Catholicism as uniform both in practice and in culture. But the history of the Church in our province disproves that assumption. Thanks to the great ultramontane revolution of the 19th century, Catholics read the same books, they shared a liturgy, and they viewed the same artwork. But the lived experiences of believers in Glace Bay or Dominion was different from the lived experiences of Catholics in Pictou Landing or in Halifax or in Toronto. So in an era when many historians seek broad transnational narratives, I think regional histories like Disciples of Antigonish remain very important. There are many interesting books that examine Catholicism from atop the 7 hills of Rome. And while the liturgy and legalities of the faith were unquestionably guided by Roman bureaucrats, faith is always lived out locally. And I would argue that few Catholic communities in North America have as rich and complicated history as those who called the industrial communities of Cape Breton home. Now, my book begins in the 1880s for a couple of reasons. First, there had been a full-scale history, as mentioned, of Catholicism in the region done by Father Angus Anthony Johnson in the 1960s and 1970s that ended with the events of the 1870s. Most important, however, the 1880s is a real period of transformation, both for the province and for the church. In fact, in his great book, 6 Crucial Decades, my old professor at St. Mary's, John Reed, talked about the importance of the 1880s as the decade of industry. It's coal, of course, as you all know, that makes Sydney command attention. And the narrative of coal and the story of Catholicism in eastern Nova Scotia are intertwined. So the decision to build the intercolonial railway across Cape Breton Island in the late 1880s deeply affects both church and industry. Until that point, the center of Catholicism in eastern Nova Scotia, both physically and psychologically, has been based in coastal Ayrshire in Richmond County, and then in the mainland village of Antigonish. This is where the cathedrals, the early convent schools, the small diocesan college, this is where they've all been built. So in other words, Catholicism in eastern Nova Scotia was rural, it's a coastal, it's agrarian, and its important infrastructure is located within 60 kilometers of the Strait of Canso. There were, of course, parishes in the greater Sydney area. Sydney Sacred Heart, constructed in 1823, North Sydney in 1853, and St. Anne's in Glace Bay in 1866. Yet despite the development of the region throughout the middle decades of the 19th century, if you read through the papers of administrators like Bishop Colin Francis McKinnon, the second bishop to guide the Diocese of Ayrshire and Antigonish, the parishes on this end of the province are on the periphery, both geographically and administratively. To travel from Antigonish town to Glace Bay, for example, requires multiple coach rides and 2 ferries. Occasionally, a steamer transports the bishop on his confirmation tours. The travel is long and it's taxing. So the ability to travel from Sydney to the Strait of Canso in 3 or 4 hours is a very, very significant development. Now, the intercolonial railway that directly links the Cape Breton coalfields to Canada is a boon for industrial development as well, as you all know. We know from the many exhaustive histories written in this period, the physical expansion of the greater Sydney area after the 1893 creation of the Dominion Coal Company was unprecedented. Coastal communities such as Glace Bay, which had been a collection of collieries at the far end of the island, were within a few years now teeming with coal miners and their families. Most of the Catholic records that we have from the mid-19th century come from the papers of Archbishop Colin Francis McKinnon, who I mentioned, and Bishop John Cameron. And while rich and in-depth, they are generally mute on the early relationship between the aforementioned churches and the old General Mining Association that predated the Dominion Coal Company. And I think that goes back to the fact that the Catholic community in Sydney and Glace Bay in this period are really on the periphery still. While dominated by issues like college grants and party politics, there's little comment in their correspondence on issues related to the working population of Sydney, such as the Provincial Workmen's Association, the Miners' Union, which was formed in 1879. In other words, the greater Sydney area is not yet part of the church's strategic plan. Well, the church has some very minor spats with the General Mining Association. By and large, the relationship is cooperative. And this has historic repercussions, because in 1883, the Diocese of Antigonish agreed to exempt Catholic miners from attending Mass on Saints' Days in return for the collection of church dues at the pay office. Now, this is a huge, huge, huge development. I mean, it is, but it's a big deal because, as I note in the first chapter of my book, titled Building a Catholic Sub-State, by collecting church dues directly from the company paymaster, the parishes now have a healthy and regular stream of income. There's now money to build churches and halls and later hospitals, and there are monies to send back to the general diocesan coffers. And this is important because the access to financial resources generated by coal comes just as the Nova Scotian Church is completing its ultramontane facelift. So what is ultramontanism? Cemented during the First Vatican Council, it declares the Pope infallible in papal teaching and statement. But as important, it allows Rome to tighten the reins and bring about uniformity in Catholic religious practice. It's a movement of devotionalism. It's gentrification and its Romanization. If you ever go to Antigonish town, go have a look at St. Ninian's Cathedral and ask yourself what a Romanesque building that you might see in Florence is doing in the woods of eastern Nova Scotia, and that's Ultramontanism. But with the Roman Curia now having more control over developments across the globe, Catholic bishops have a strict blueprint of how to build their dioceses. And thanks to Cole, the Diocese of Antigonish has monies to create a strong Catholic sub-state. New parishes are opened in places such as Sydney Mines, Bridgeport, Victoria Mines, New Aberdeen, Whitney Pier, and in Dominion. Respected teaching congregations of women religious such as the Sisters of Charity and the Congregation of Notre Dame opened convent schools in the area. In 1890, the Catholic Mutual Benefit Association, an early provider of life insurance, is organized in the coalfields, and St. Joseph's Hospital in Glace Bay is opened in 1902. The church is staking a claim as a force within Cape Breton society, and it's an era of extreme optimism for Catholics. Now, there are in fact so many Catholic workers pouring into the colliery towns that by 1901, the Diocese of Antigonish is forced to conduct a census to accurately report on the demographic changes. In a few short years, Sydney Sacred Heart and Glace Bay St. Anne's Parish both doubled in size. Catholics crammed into the pews. They crowded the parish picnics and joined societies in record numbers. The opening ceremonies of the 1901 mission at St. Anne's, for example, were witnessed by over 2,000 people. I am positive that large numbers of the men do not come to Mass, wrote an anxious curate at Sacred Heart, simply because they cannot get into the church. God help us if these people come to Easter duties. Now, in our post-secular society, it's a struggle to impart on students or even the general public the incredible importance of the local parishes at this time. Statistics tell us that church attendance was extremely high, and the church community was a place for newcomers to seek employment or housing, and for many migrants it offered a permanency in an otherwise transitional and unfamiliar environment. Temperance societies battled alcohol. The League of the Cross opened halls with pool tables to occupy young people, while everyone kept to a strict liturgical schedule. There were Holy Week, October devotions, 40-hour devotions, and the summertime missions, which were held over a 2-week period to accommodate coal miners who worked day or night shifts on alternate weeks. It was a perfectly contained society within itself. Now, the demographics of eastern Nova Scotia have always been diverse. We know that. After Jesuit missionaries were welcomed into Mi'kmaq in the 17th century, the faith was cultivated and protected by the indigenous Mi'kmaq, further addressed by French-speaking Acadians in the 18th century, then strengthened by Gaelic-speaking migrants from Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland in the early 19th century. But there was now large communities of Italians from both north and south, skilled iron workers from Austria, Newfoundlanders, Syrians, laborers from the French-speaking island of St. Pierre, families from Poland, Russia, Hungary, and even parts of Asia. There are only a few places in the Catholic world at this time that have this kind of multi-ethnic demographic. If you're going to talk about New York City in this period, for its diversity, you must also talk about Cape Breton. But as I note in the book, this rich tapestry presents some problems. It's a truism that immigrants to any country find comfort and safety by congregating with other expatriates. So the desire for ethnic parishes like the Italian St. Nicholas, constructed in Whitney Pier in 1911, and St. Mary's Polish Church, constructed in 1913, was natural. The priests who administered these churches, such as Father Domenico Viola, did Herculean work, but sometimes old world politics created problems in the new. More problematic was that ethnic parishes challenged the universality of the ultramontane movement and created deep tensions over established territories. For example, priests grumbled about opening the Italian St. Nicholas Church smack dab within the parish boundaries of Whitney Pier's Holy Redeemer. There was confusion as to where an Italian miner, say living in New Waterford, was supposed to attend Mass, and whether Italian children were supposed to be confirmed in the parishes in which they lived, or all in one place. How did someone qualify to belong to an ethnic parish? Perhaps most important, how could any ethnic parish grow in population without sustained immigration from the old country? So in this period, there are many such hotly contested debates going on within a church adapting to a population explosion. Externally, and I mention this only briefly as it's very interesting, I found that the traditional scourge of sectarianism that dominates other mixed industrial communities such as Glasgow, Scotland, was not, with some exceptions, convent schools being one, a real problem or an issue in Cape Breton. The hierarchies and spoils at the workplace were mostly divided up equally, and as historians have noted, the men seemed to care more about one's workplace skill set than their faith. When the Scottish-born John Cameron collected the first subscription for his new church in the multi-ethnic community of New Aberdeen in 1902, it was supported generously, I was surprised to find, by many Protestants. So that's what the early part of my book really speaks to. It's this institutional growth brought about by the newfound financial resources generated by coal. And this is not limited to the aforementioned happenings in industrial Cape Breton. Okay, this is going on across the diocese. New buildings, all generated, for the most part, by the burgeoning coal industry. Yet, as you all know, these developments belied some very stark truths. While the injection of Catholic labor into the region's steady church coffers and supported great physical expansion, the social and economic realities of a 20th century industrial community presents Catholics with a host of new problems. I'm sure that most of you are aware of the fascinating and complex history of the Cape Breton labor movement. If not, we're mere steps from the Beaton Institute, that repository that houses that great story. A big part of Disciples of Antigonish deals with the church's response to organized labor. I focus on this narrative because it's a story that's not been adequately told. It's a narrative that was long mythologized, and it's a history that has always captured my own personal attention. As a graduate student, I devoured the work of labor historians like David Frank and Don McGilvery, who taught here at CBU for many years. Their work is captivating, but if it had a flaw, and this is what I spent most of my early graduate work on, it was a reliance on the supposition that the local Catholic Church opposed the Cape Breton labor movement. Keep that in mind. So what did I find? At the turn of the 20th century, there's a deep lack of engagement by the local church in matters pertaining to the relationship between labor and capital. Although excerpts from Pope Leo XIII's famous 1891 encyclical on labor, Rerum Novarum, were printed in the diocesan press, and there were occasional references to the issues at the pithead from the pulpit, there is no intellectual engagement with an encyclical that dealt with issues of subsidiarity, solidarity, and property. Now, what makes Rerum Novarum so groundbreaking was that it was Rome's first attempt to offer social teaching that was not general, avoid sin, or vague, do good. Okay? Rerum Novarum offers some specifics. Had more Catholics in Nova Scotia studied Rerum Novarum, they would have discovered that the document addressed many of the issues already plaguing parishes in Cape Breton. When the gallery mine at Port Morion was closed in November 1897, the Catholic press commented on the miners' legitimate complaints against their employer, but added nothing about the encyclical's demand that the state safeguard the interests of the worker. The following year, there were reports of a strong sentiment among miners against company stores, yet there was no comment in the Catholic press on Rerum Novarum's call for natural justice, or its condemnation of the compulsion of workers to accept conditions against their will. When the mine near New Victoria closed in 1898, reports noted that no account was taken of the misery into which the poor honest miners and their families were plunged. Yet once again, there is no comment on Rerum Novarum's demand that special consideration be given to the weak and to the poor. The reality is that until the 1920s, the Diocese of Antigonish has no official position on labor-capital relations or the conditions under which the flock labored. Now, there are several reasons for this reality. And the first one is that the priests who ministered in the colliery towns in the early 20th century were all natives of rural, agriculturally based communities. Father Ronald MacDonald of Glace Bay was from the farm fields of Pictou. Father Ronald McDougall of St. Anthony's was from southwest Margaree. At Reserve Mines, Father Rory McGuinness was from Westlake Ainslie. The list goes on and on and on. These are classically educated farm boys with no experience with industry. It doesn't mean that they're not aware of what's going on, or they're not affected by what's happening in their parishes, only that they do not have the knowledge or the training to meet the need. And second, although some historians shy away from the great man theory of history, the priests in this room will tell you that within the Catholic structure, the personality and inclinations of the local bishop are paramount. We can talk synodality until we're blue in the face, but you cannot accomplish anything in a Catholic diocese if the bishop is in opposition. And Bishop John Cameron, Bishop of Antigonish from 1877 to 1910, although a giant intellect within the Canadian Church, he even gets the first Catholic Prime Minister elected in his constituency, was not overly interested in the coal fields of Cape Breton. When a 1909 civil war breaks out between the established union, the Provincial Workmen's Association, and the fledgling United Mine Workers, Bishop Cameron was 82 years old and ill health, months away from death, and completely focused on his succession. Now, none of what I said excuses the failure of the local church from forming a more robust response to the social conditions percolating in Cape Breton before 1910. But it's simplistic and wrong to argue that local pastors didn't care or that the church sided with the coal company. With no guidance from the bishop, priests are left to choose sides for themselves, which makes two particular personalities and events from the miners' strike of 1909 so very important. They're Father Charles MacDonald in the machine gun incident at Bridgeport, and Father John Anthony Fraser and the evicted miners of New Aberdeen. Now, without getting into too many details, they're all in the book. The events of the infamous Bridgeport machine gun incident are as follows. Father Charles MacDonald is pastor of a parish that mostly supports retaining the old Provincial Workmen's Association as the miners' union. Returning home from St. Joseph's Hospital, which he founded, he is met by a Captain William Almond, and it took me it took me quite a while to actually find out who this person was, because we only ever had the last name, of the Canadian militia, who tells him that supporters of the United Mine Workers are planning to march to the parish. According to Father MacDonald, Almond does not want the soldiers and strikers mixing and asks permission to place his men on church property to keep them off the street. MacDonald consents, and he returns to the hospital. Hours later, the parading UMW strikers are not only met by those soldiers, but also a rapid-fire gun that has been placed on the steps of the church. It's an infamous moment in the history of Nova Scotia Catholicism. Now, over in New Aberdeen, where many of those parading strikers had come from, Father John Anthony Fraser, who believes the UMW should replace the old PWA, offers moral and material support to his striking flock. Besides his anger over the poor pay and exploitation of his parishioners, the priest even claimed that the coal company had forced the parish's children off their playground as it encroached on company property. He contended until his dying days that the Dominion Coal Company stopped at nothing to outrage the poor people. During the difficult summer months of the 1900 strike, Fraser lodged the evicted miners in the church basement, schoolhouse, and rectory. He was a popular figure in his parish and certainly within the working class literature of Cape Breton. Now, what's compelling is that both of these stories, both stories have been used for years as evidence that the priests of the Diocese of Antigonish opposed the burgeoning United Mine Workers and therefore the early agitation of the Cape Breton working classes. Now, despite the fact that Father MacDonald in Bridgeport faced an ecclesiastical investigation and maintained his innocence, he made awful choices, and we can all understand why generations were angry at the church for his actions. That Father Fraser's activities, though, on behalf of the UMW, also are used to condemn the local church as anti-labor is much more interesting. In the historiography, you see Bishop Cameron punishes Fraser for supporting his striking parishioners. And this stems from the work of the popular writer John Mellor, who wrote in his 1983 book, The Company Store, that the other priests of the colliery towns were so outraged by Father Fraser's support of the UMW that they formally complained to Bishop Cameron. And that same evening, Mellor writes, Father Jim received word from Cameron that he must leave New Aberdeen at once. He was given a new parish in Antigonish County under the watchful eye of the bishop and far away from the strike scene. The strikers and their families were ordered to leave the church forthwith. It was, Mellor noted, shocking, but true. The problem, of course, is nothing could be further from the truth. Neither Father MacDonald nor Father Fraser were transferred away from their parishes. MacDonald stays in Bridgeport until his death in 1948, and Fraser in New Aberdeen until 1916, when ill health, he dies in 1918, necessitates a transfer. It's not the last time that myth would be used to turn the local Catholic Church into either a saint or a sinner. The analysis should be, and I think I make the case in my book, that the Catholic clergy in the early 20th century were as divided on working class issues as the miners of the PWA and the UMW themselves. At Sacred Heart in Sydney, Father Donald McAdam roasts the UMW from the pulpit for being socialistic. But at St. Anthony's in Glace Bay, Father Alexander Mackenzie allows one outspoken UMW leader who had been evicted from his company home to live in the parish's former glebe house as the caretaker. Company officials demanded an investigation, but it went nowhere. Now, we obviously can't leave it there, of course, because when the Provincial Workmen's Association is finally replaced during the Great War, first by the Amalgamated Mine Workers and then UMW District 26, Labor's voice becomes louder, becomes more unified, and it becomes more aggressive. And that agitation forces the church to respond officially. So this is part of the book I really enjoyed writing because it tracks the transformation of the Catholic Church in Cape Breton between 1917 and 1925 from a basic position of xenophobia and anti-Marxism to one that slowly begins to identify with the realities of its flock and finds a voice as a purveyor of social Catholicism. Now, Bishop Cameron dies in 1910, and he's replaced by Bishop James Morrison. Now, despite the fact that the Diocese of Antigonish now relies heavily on the financial resources generated by coal miners and steel workers, even the Catholic College in Antigonish changes its curriculum to bolster the sciences. The issues of industry have no bearing on Morrison's selection. There are many good reasons to put James Morrison in Antigonish. He's the former rector of St. Dunstan's College in Charlottetown, so he'll be a strong hand at Son of X. But the farm boy from Savage Harbor knew zero about coal, he knew zero about steel, and he knew zero about the conditions under which the majority of his flock in communities such as Glace Bay and New Waterford worked and lived. With the leadership of UMW District 26 increasingly in the hands of more radical and well-known voices like James Bryce and McLaughlin, Morrison could not follow his predecessor's disengagement. With the violent Bolshevik takeover of Russia as a backdrop, attacks on organized religion by District 26, warranted or not, scared many Catholic elites. Much worse, the incessant wage cuts of the newly formed British Empire and Steel Corporation meant now less monies are coming into church coffers, and priests are struggling to pay mortgages and combat increasing poverty. As embarrassing reports of a growing radicalism among Catholic miners become public, Bishop Morrison first blames newly arrived immigrants from Eastern Europe and even suggests that the newfound militancy of Catholic labor is due to a laxity in mass attendance and poor catechism. Now, I argue in this book and in my preceding book that no one's more responsible for the Antigonish movement than James Morrison. But at this point in his career, things are really becoming a bit farcical. Take, for example, the 1921 sacking of the New Aberdeen Company store, known in history as the Pluckney store. Shaken by the raid, the priest at St. John the Baptist, the East Bay native James Angus Mary Gillis, quickly wrote to assure his bishop that not a single parishioner of his had been involved. Not one. Morrison replies with congratulations to the Catholics of New Aberdeen for their good sense of religious and moral honesty. Now, this is totally ridiculous, because of course Catholics in New Aberdeen were involved. In fact, historical memory of my own family recalls how a person with a single shoe would go from 1st to 10th Street looking to see if they could trade off with somebody else who might have stolen the other part of the fare. So they were all involved. You see, the denial of reality in this period meant that the church had sort of lost the plot. The formal stance against the Marxist rhetoric of some of the most radical labor leaders was fine and well. But the archives demonstrate that Catholic miners and steel workers were more concerned with their daily realities than any ideological position. Catholics are angry. They're struggling to feed and clothe their children. They're faithful and devoted to the Sacred Heart. They devoutly pray the Rosary in the month of October. They belong to societies like the League of the Cross. They donate to parish picnics. They donate to a diocesan college that most of their children won't have a chance to attend. They collect for a cathedral to support their bishop who lived 200 kilometers away, etc., etc. But they look at their church and they don't see any reciprocal material or moral support. And for a period in the early 1920s, the church simply loses its authority over Catholic labor. Please, please, please don't buy into the old stereotype that Catholics just pay, pray, and obey, because the history of this region says otherwise. In fact, things got so bad for Bishop Morrison that he could not even issue a pastoral letter in support of moderate candidates for the 1922 UMW District 26 executive elections. He knows it won't help the moderates and may in fact drive more Catholics to vote for the more radical candidates. I mean, this is incredible. To me, this is like incredible stuff, because far from the ultramontane model of strict obedience and uniformity, by the early 1920s, Catholic workers in Cape Breton are more likely to oppose the wishes of their religious leadership. It's a story that's not often told, for sure. Now, a good portion of Disciples of Antigonish deals with the narrative of the St. Francis Xavier University Extension Department, which was known globally as the Antigonish movement. But to understand why the diocese creates the Extension Department in 1928, you must appreciate this loss of moral authority, not only in Glace Bay and in Reserve, but among the fishermen of Isle Nadan and the farmers of Guysborough County. Now, the initial move to implement Catholic social teaching in the industrial centers of Cape Breton is a diverse and fascinating story. There were study clubs organized by priests like Father later Archbishop John Hugh MacDonald, a people's school administered by Father Thomas O'Reilly Boyle, a fascinating character that somebody, I hope a student, an honor student or a graduate student might do a project on one day, because we need to know more about Thomas O'Reilly Boyle. And lectures on labor by American Catholic intellectuals like Father James Ryan, a pioneer in the application of Catholic theology to questions of social justice and industrial society. And this shift in strategy is made clear during the notorious coal strike of 1925, when Bishop Morrison formally asked the province to intercede and issues pastoral letters calling upon Catholics to send material aid to the colliery towns. A special collection is taken up to the region, and the monies are distributed by a formal committee here in Sydney. Now, was that financial support a drop in the bucket? Yes, of course. Did it alleviate all the tremendous suffering? Of course it did not. But it did demonstrate a recognition of the realities of rank-and-file Catholics and a desire to make a stand on issues like a living wage. This is really a turning point. It's a major moment, not just here, but for the Canadian Church. And I think priests are even surprised at the time by the positive reaction to this newfound policy, even in quarters that were traditionally hostile. And the archives are full of evidence. Well, the Church was powerless to change the policy of the British Empire and Steel Corporation, and still had profound differences with some of UMW District 26's leadership. It acknowledged that its responsibilities to the families in the pew went well beyond the Sunday Mass. The Church could have philosophical differences with any given movement that their people embraced, but nonetheless they had a responsibility to those people. Aiding families materially held power that wore pastoral letters and Catholic Truth Society pamphlets. Many of those who have heretofore been very critical of the diocese, wrote an excited Father John Hugh MacDonald from Sydney, are now loud in their praises of the prompt action taken. And those praises grew louder in April 1925 when the president of BESCO accused the diocese, quote, of taking sides against the company. The application of Catholic social teaching to the social and economic challenges of the region after 1925 dominates the mindset of the Antigonish diocese. What is a living wage? What are the responsibilities between the worker and his employer? What reforms can be carried out at the parish level? What level of responsibility do Catholics have to one another? And it's the last question that pushes the growing recognition by the mid-1930s that priests and women religious can't do everything. As a social historian, this is the part of the book, the part that examines a laity that was coming of age, that was really fun to write. When, for example, the Son of X Extension Department opens the Glace Bay field office in 1932, they turn not to a priest, but to the 45-year-old former labor leader, Alexander McIntyre, as the face of the movement in the community. While lay women were always extremely active and influential in the parishes, they're now gaining public recognition. In 1921, the second chapter of the Catholic Women's League in the diocese is organized at Sacred Heart in Sydney with a call to local women to sort out the social problems of their own parishes. At the same time, women religious who had long ministered mostly in schools and in hospitals are expanding into social work. In 1935, the Catholic Charities and Welfare Association is opened in Sydney under the Sisters of St. Martha. Within a broadly defined program, the Marthas collaborated with other organizations like the Children's Aid Society to encourage and support families. In 1939 and 1940 alone, the women made over 1,800 visits to local homes, filled 324 food orders, provided 240 pairs of shoes, operated an employment bureau, a youth club, and financed summer camps. Now, we could talk for hours about the real successes of the Antigonish movement and the important Catholic social action that occurs in industrial Cape Breton. Many of you will be aware of the credit unions and consumer cooperatives, or the libraries and housing cooperatives of Father James J. Tompkins and Mary Arnold at Reserve Mines. And this is all very important, and it's all well documented. Well documented. But we must also confront the reality that the Extension Department often struggled in the colliery towns. While there were some successes in creating an alternative economic system in the coastal and agrarian communities of the maritime provinces, the complexities of industry, markets, finance, capital overwhelmed Extension field workers. Even Monsignor Cody, who never felt completely comfortable among the colliers, privately conceded that miners and steelworkers lacked the resources and organization to become masters of their own destiny. Consequently, some of Extension's solutions to the problems of poverty, such as encouraging idle miners to plant potatoes on vacant plots of land, or having men relocate their families completely to the countryside, were sometimes met with hostility. There were even fears that Catholics in the colliery towns were not absorbing the Extension message. Of the 76 Extension students who followed the courses at the university during the early winter, Bishop Morrison grumbled in 1937, there was scarcely a male representative from the mining towns with the exception of New Waterford. Yet despite these challenges, there's a remarkable demographic change taking place institutionally. Between 1885 and 1925, 136 priests were ordained for the Diocese of Antigonish, and only 14 came from the greater Sydney area. In fact, the people of Sacred Heart had to wait until 1918 to have one of their own, Michael Leo O'Connell, ordained, and it was not until 1931 that a similar scene occurred at St. Anne's in Glace Bay. By the 1930s, however, the diocese begins recruiting seminarians out of the colliery towns at a staggering rate. Of the 192 priests ordained specifically for pastoral work in eastern Nova Scotia between 1925 and 1960, 129 came from the greater Sydney area. That's almost 70%. That's incredible. Why is it important? It's a big deal. Why is it a big deal? It's because priests like Father Mickey McDonald and Father Michael J. McKinnon now come from the colliery towns, and so they naturally have an interest in finding solutions to the economic and social problems of their parishes. And they're also very comfortable with the language of labor, okay? They've been around the wash house. They've been around the union hall. And the rhetoric that they hear there doesn't scare them. Many others, such as the young seminarian George Topsheet, put themselves through school by working in the Sydney steel mill or transporting coal. And the effects of this demographic change are far-reaching. In the book, I write about how the Diocese of Antigonish gave permission for its flock to vote for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, in 1940, 3 years before the Canadian bishops issued a similar statement. During the 1946 steelworkers strike, a $2,000 personal donation was made to the strike fund by the priests of Holy Redeemer, St. Teresa's, and Sacred Heart. According to Tom McLaughlin, the son of the legendary radical J.B. McLaughlin, the, quote, totally unexpected donation was the most heartening sign yet of support for the National Wage Campaign outside the ranks of labor organizations themselves. During the brief coal strike of 1947, the Cape Breton clergy met, and included in this group was Father Charles MacDonald from the Bridgeport rapid fire gun incident, and voted to donate to the Miners' Relief Fund. This time, however, they wanted the money to come directly from the parish coffers. It had to be done, argued the 44-year-old Sydney native Father Raymond T. Campbell, lest they be seen as favoring the rich. The pastor at Sydney Mines, 42-year-old Father Daniel Leo McIsaac, and another Sydney native, demanded a special sacrifice, while the historian Father A.A. Johnston, then ministering at Mount Carmel in New Waterford, argued that using parish funds to support strikers was reasonable, as it was the miners who have built their churches and their schools. So while the headquarters of the Son of X Extension Department are securely on the mainland, by 1950, industrial Cape Breton is the center of Catholic social thought, agitation, and action. Priests such as James Boyle, who served at Holy Redeemer in Sydney until 1944, are made bishops in other parts of the country in the hope that Catholic action will take root in those communities. There's an explosion of new church construction as the boundaries of the older parishes like Sacred Heart are redrawn. There are retreat centers, Catholic youth organization clubhouses that host maritime-wide conventions. And with larger populations, the parishes in the greater Sydney area offer facilities and services unheard of in the countryside. Despite all of this activity, however, by the end of the Second World War, Catholics in the colliery towns still could not shake the sense that they remained on the periphery of the diocese. When Bishop Morrison died in April 1950, he was replaced by Bishop John R. MacDonald. Now, hailed by priests at Extension such as Monsignor Moses Cody as an administrator who could energize the Antigonish movement, it was not lost on the priests of Cape Breton that MacDonald had spent his entire career in rural mainland parishes before his appointment as rector of St. Ninian's Cathedral and then as Bishop of Peterborough, Ontario. If the greater Sydney area was the center of Catholic social thought and agitation, and if the future of the diocese relied heavily on a strong industrial economy, why did the new bishop not reflect that fact? The complaints were loud enough right after Morrison died to compel the apostolic delegate to seek opinions on erecting the Cape Breton diocese. Now, these frustrations are more than partly responsible for the very institution in which we sit this afternoon. Cape Breton University is the offspring of Xavier Junior College, which the Diocese of Antigonish opened in the autumn of 1951 under considerable pressure to offer Sydney's Catholics access to post-secondary education. Similarly, when Monsignor Cody retires from his post as director of the Extension Department in 1952, he's replaced by the quiet and shy son of a coal miner, the Sydney Mines native Father Michael Joseph McKinnon. So finally, it seems that industrial Cape Breton is in the church's front view mirror. Now, my book ends with the events of the late 1950s, and it's a good place to end, because various forces are starting to gain momentum, which will gradually push the priests and the women religious back into the sanctuary. Soon, it won't matter who is at the helm of Extension and whether he is more interested in labor or in agriculture. Well, Extension field workers still did some very important work. By the early 1960s, many Catholics began to wonder if the diocese's program of subsidiarity had run its course. Was there a need for the church to remain so heavily involved in the community with secular organizations like the Cooperative Union of Nova Scotia actively pursuing economic change? Others thought that the Catholic social teaching of Eastern Nova Scotia would now be better applied in far-off lands like the Dominican Republic and Chile through the work of the Cody International Institute. As various secular forces take hold, by the 1960s, large-scale government material interventions soon dwarfed anything that the church could offer. As federal taxpayer-funded entities like the Cape Breton Development Corporation worked to diversify the local economy, the clergymen who had once organized rural and industrial conferences slowly went back to baptisms and funerals. Federal ministers like Alan J. McCacken, who once proclaimed the message of subsidiarity from the diocesan airwaves, now doled out taxpayer monies on various schemes. Priests like Father Andy Hogan and Father George Topsy would still make names for themselves as leaders in the Cape Breton colliery towns. Hogan was elected to Parliament in 1974, but their authority was on the wane, and the church struggled to remain relevant in social and economic fields. The reality was that the gradual acceptance of government monies for schools, colleges, and hospitals meant that the Catholic subculture, so carefully built up by the Ultramontane Bishop Cameron, preserved and expanded by Archbishop Morrison, and utilized resourcefully by Bishop MacDonald, gradually weakened. Many diocesan institutions like Xavier Junior College remained Catholic in ethos, but as the government increased its provision of financial resources, the church could no longer call the tune. As Bishop MacDonald's biographer, the Dominion native Father Peter Nearing noted, the government moved in behind the church and took over the fields they plowed and seeded. There was no secret as to what was happening, but little, it seemed, to be done to stop it. But that's a story for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We're now going to take questions. Now, if anyone has a question, they're welcome to either come forward and ask it here or simply shout it out and I will repeat it.
The report, a friend of mine said there was a fire. slightly afterwards. Did it have anything to do with the machine gun nest on the? Okay, yeah.
So there was a fire in Bridgeport. Did it have anything to do with the machine gun incident?
Yes, just
Not,
sorry.
yeah, not that I know of. What happened? So what happens is McDonald comes back from the testimony that I've read. McDonald comes back, and he's very up. They're immediately the UMW marchers go home. A lot of them were from New Aberdeen, and they start a petition which they want to send to the bishop to have McDonald removed. And not only the UMW supporters upset, but many of McDonald's own people, even though they support the PWA, they're pretty shocked by it too, because nobody actually knows what has happened. McDonald pleads as innocent, and he just, he writes letters saying, I can't believe any of my parishioners would think I'd ever let, a gun be placed on the steps. And so, he's censored a little bit, but there's a lot of bad blood, and he does spend a lot of time, decades, really trying to walk back from that decision. Was it careless? My sense is that I can't imagine that he ever would have allowed that, to giving consent to that gun, but it was just very careless on his part. But I haven't read anything about a fire, but there could have been.
Yeah.
A lot of people were very
That was
angry.
a friend of mine who,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if that was, how you get urban legend,
Right.
only this time perhaps a rural legend.
Yeah.
So,
Can you repeat the question for the video? Whatever question was that, just repeat it.
Yeah, all right.
That you took the video.
I'm trying to relate some of the things you're saying with the book written by two St. Bex professors about the Cody Institute and the efforts of the Antigonish movement when they began to become institutionalized inside of St. Bex. It's as if they also became distant from the problems on the ground, that the people who occupied positions were not so much instigators as, say, someone like Jimmy Tompkins, who was in a parish and was getting his hands dirty in a sense, trying to get the people to do something. There tended to be a movement away from that to a more, sociological perspective or something. Is that a fair portrayal of what happened to the Extension Department and that attempt to institutionalize the Antigonish movement in St. Bex?
Yeah, so that's a good question, whether the Extension Department became institutionalized as the years went on. I think the first thing we have to recognize is the problem of the Cody International Institute. So by the late 1950s, John R. MacDonald has really turned his gaze to Latin America, and he's been asked to do that. Like, he was formally asked by the Curia to take the principles that he learned in Christmas Island and Iona and take them south. And that's what he wants to do. And he dies just before he can implement it. But they bring Monsignor Smythe home, or I don't know if it's Smith or Smythe home, to take over this new Cody Institute. They get a big grant from Archbishop Cushing in Boston. And so the Cody Institute was always to work in other places,
Yes.
which caused a lot of confusion, caused a lot of jealousy. And it's happening right at the time when, as I mentioned, Extension is looking around, and it's not necessarily always a bad problem. It's just, think of Extension having birthed a lot of these organizations, like the Nova Scotia Credit Union League. They're out doing now what Cody and Roy Burgengran had done at Reserve Mines, when they first organized that credit union. So people are in the field doing it. So they're looking around and saying, well, what are we really supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is they start shifting towards, we're going to be educators,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I'll give you information
Yeah.
and you can do what you want with it.
Yes.
And that's the institutional part, and that's where a lot of people think they ended up losing their way.
Yes.
So for people today trying to, thinking about reforming, revitalizing the diocese or parish, individual parishes, how can we mine our history? What kind of intended?
Yeah.
For some sort of key takeaways? Or are we sort of weighed down by this history? Is this sort of DNA inescapable or something negative aspect of it?
Yeah, great question about, what does the history tell us about some of the things that we can do today. I mean, I think it's a great question. I was at an opening of a Baptist church a couple of years ago, and there's a man named Harry Gardner. He's a great man. He was kind of, the bishop of the Baptists, if you will. He was president of Acadia Divinity College. And he gave a wonderful talk. It had a lovely museum and historical display, and he was kind of saying, well, all that's great, but like that's their contribution, right? So what's our contribution going to be? I think it is in our DNA to a degree. I think we've got to get back to the church having a position. We have to define what that position is, and we have to offer it to people. And I think it's one of the things, especially where Pope Francis, one of the things he talked about was like, avoiding culture wars. I don't think that what these people were doing, they didn't battle anybody. In fact, one of the things I find really fascinating, there was a lot of people who objected to Monsignor Cody in the Extension Department, especially say if you were a lumberman in Isle Madame. Well, now you've got these people starting cooperatives that are in direct competition with you. So, but they didn't go out and have disparaging remarks about anybody. They just said, this is our teaching, this is what we're going to offer people. And so they were never in conflict with anyone. I think we can get back to that and find a place in the public square, but we've got to do a better job at standing up and having a voice and trying to understand what Catholic social teaching is. I think a lot of people don't know what it is. We're not educated enough on it, but if we can get there and we can offer it and put it out there, I think that would be a great start.
I remember back then, when I was ordained, Monsignor Smith wanted me to work with the Cody International, but the guys that sent me to the university to teach because I was working on my doctorate for engineering. But there was a lot of animosity between the priests that were teaching at the college and the Cody International, because they were getting a lot of press and prominence, and they were very important. And they had that new building from Boston. He put a lot of money into that institute, which is no longer extant. But it was that was the problem, that their focus on the Central America and so on, rather than on the problems we have here in Europe. And of course, that's the problem that's continuing now. The main political force is in Halifax, and that's where the money is being concentrated and placed rather than where it's needed here in Cape Breton. And as you know, there's this synchronization thing, which I'm involved with, and Cape Breton Regional Municipality generates over 51% of what should be coming to the province to give to us. But the $2 billion, $800 and some million that is coming to the province, we only get $15 million out of that, instead of the 51%, which would be $1,400 million. And that's why we're in a very depressed situation down here. And even the senator from Memberton said a few years ago that we were dying community here because we are so impoverished in many, many aspects. So that's what we're fighting for. And it's always the concentration, the political concentration in the central areas like Halifax and so on, which contribute nothing to the poverty that we're having. Anyway, I just want to point that out, that those policies really cause a great amount of concern here in the industrial area.
Yeah, now it's interesting to say about Halifax too, because again, you go back to what they were doing with study clubs. So study clubs weren't just about you learning, like you teaching me about engineering, right? It was also getting information from me, getting information from the community. Even from the lowliest guy in the community had something to say about his life, conditions under which he worked. And they took that information in the old days and they'd liaise with the Extension Department and use that information to try to find solutions. What you'll find now with a lot of extension type organizations, they're just taking what Halifax has given them, best practice, right? And they're trying to implement that as best they can in the community. That's opposite of what the early extension folks are trying to do.
Yeah, it's all from the top down rather than from the bottom up. Politically and religiously.
Yeah.
The old concept that the Pope is the servus servorum, the servant of the servants. And he served the bishops, and the bishops are serving the priests, and the priests are supposed to be serving the people. It's almost the reverse. We think that we have to serve the priests have to serve the bishop, and the bishop have to serve the Pope. It's all the wrong way, isn't it?
I have a friend who said the church has a servant problem. Sorry.
But just to, if I could just make a comment about our diocese and that, one of the things that I loved about it is like all our women religious did tremendous work. Congregation Notre Dame, they did what they did, the charities were in the hospitals. But I grew up with the Marthas, and people used to say, well, and the Marthas were beloved in a different way because I think people just felt they were, at that time, there were very few PhDs, they were very service oriented, and they got into the mud and the dirt that sometimes was family life. But look how revered they were because of that, right? I mean, it does come, there is a lot of, there's a lot to be gained by sometimes getting into those places.
I pick up that there was a non-understanding of some of the bishops regarding the industrial area and rural agriculture, that kind of thing, and the industrial area. In your research, have you come across the desire to have the Episcopal See moved from rural, distant, aloof to where the people live? Any information on that?
Yeah, so a question about why, essentially why, the center of the diocese was in Antigonish. Were there ever thoughts about having it moved? I haven't. There's a lot of information about why, in the early days, McKinnon wanted to get off Isle Madame. There was really the reason, a lot of people don't know, really the reason that he put the college in Antigonish in the 1850s was because Archbishop William Walsh of Halifax wanted the 3 mainland counties. And he would write constantly to Rome saying, all the Highlanders are in Cape Breton, so give McKinnon Cape Breton, and the Archdiocese of Halifax will take the 3 mainland counties. That was his fear at the time. But there were always grumblings later on, especially when Cole becomes king here, that the distance, and as I say, not just geographically, but psychologically, between these two communities was great. The only rumblings I ever saw was in 1937 when Thomas O'Reilly Boyle and Father Leo Keats at St. Peter's talk about having a college here in Sydney. But then they thought, well, no, what happened to Father James Tompkins in 1922 when he started agitating for stuff, he got sent to Canso, that's probably going to happen to us. So they said, don't bother. But when John R. MacDonald's selected in 1950, then you really see it. Like, what are we doing? It makes sense. Like, it's not just that the people here, which is a big part of the diocese, are living and working in conditions that the bishops don't understand. But the fortunes of the diocese are tied to a robust economy, whatever it might look like here. That's the frustration. If you don't know anything about it, how are we going to fix it? And they know by the 1950s that things are starting, right? Things are starting to wane. And it's not, another 15 years before there's real trouble. So that's the only time I see it. But the answer back was, oh, no. A couple of Son of X faculty members like, oh no, that would ruin the extension department if we did that. That would ruin the Antigonish movement, the flow of the Antigonish movement. So that's why they didn't do it. But there was real agitation. Like Father Stanley MacDonald, Angus L. MacDonald's brother, he was adamant about that. This was a problem that had to be overcome. They had to have a bishop for Cape Breton. And I don't know, in retrospect, I don't know if that would have changed things. Again, I think industry was different. It was hard. You could organize amongst the lobster fishermen. You could organize in the rural areas. Could have you had coal cooperatives? I don't know. But it's just a matter of history now, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter. And now I'd like to invite up a student who's part of the CBU chaplaincy ministry team, Chidima. And Chidima actually comes from Nigeria. And she's going to give the official thank you and leave you with a few gifts.
Hello everyone. Are we happy? I can see we are. So my name is Chidima. I'm from Nigeria. I work with the team at the CBU chaplaincy, and I want to thank Dr. Lindo for the session we had today. It was quite interesting. My father would always say that the history would give you a way to the future, right? You need to know the history where you're coming from to know where you're going to. And there was something that piqued my interest during your conversation about what the CWL did in the past. And it made me know that really women make the world go around, even in the church, right? Back home, we call it CWO, the Catholic Women Organization, and they help to ensure that there is order in the church, right? They contribute a whole lot, and it's also good to hear what the CWL is doing here in Canada. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and we're going to be giving you a few gifts.
Thank you.
And this t-shirt.
Awesome, great.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you all. Great.
Thank you very much, Chidima. And finally, I just want to thank you all for being here today at chaplaincy here at Cape Breton University. Dr. Peter Ludlow will now be signing his books, and it's a great opportunity to support his research, the work he's done. And if you'd like to get one, please come forward. He'll personally sign it, and they're $40. Thank you all. God bless you.